Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the final hours of Joachim Peiper, a man whose past was a tapestry of violence and whose end was written in fire. It is the evening of July 14th, 1976, in the small, unassuming village of Traves, France. The air is thick with the languid heat of midsummer, a humid weight that clings to the skin like a damp shroud. In this corner of the hot Seine department, the river moves with a prehistoric slow motion, its dark waters reflecting the overhanging willows that dip their silvery leaves into the current. The village itself, home to barely 350 souls, is alive with the distant, muffled sounds of celebration. It is Bastille Day, and the scent of wood smoke from outdoor grills mingles with the floral perfume of lavender and blooming jasmine. You can almost hear the faint strain of an accordion from the village square, a melody that dances on the breeze before being swallowed by the vast, encompassing silence of the surrounding woods. We leave the laughter behind, walking up the gentle slope where the gravel road turns into a narrow, dirt path, leading us away from the light and into the deepening gloom of the forest edge. Nestled against the dark silhouette of the trees stands a house known as Le Renfort. It is a quiet, low-slung building, encompassing just under 100 square meters of living space. Built in the early 1960s, its stone and wood facade was meant to be a final port of call, a place where a man could disappear into the mundane rhythms of rural life. Tonight, the house is bathed in the orange and purple hues of a dying sunset. The windows, thick with the reflection of the darkening sky, hide the interior from view. Inside, the rooms are filled with the scent of old leather, dried ink, and the faint, lingering smell of the peppermint tea Joachim Peiper often drank while he worked. He is 61 years old now, his once sharp features softened by age, though his eyes remain alert, scanning the shadows beyond his porch. He has lived here for years, known to the locals only as the German, a polite but distant neighbor who walked his dogs and kept his lawn meticulously trimmed. But the peace of Le Renfort has been eroding for weeks. The floorboards beneath his feet seem to groan with the weight of anticipation, a slow, rhythmic creak that echoes in the stillness of the hallway as he moves from room to room, checking the locks and the heavy wooden shutters. The campaign against him had been building like a summer storm, inevitable and dark. It began in June, when the quiet streets of Traves were suddenly carpeted with white leaflets. Each one bore the same chilling headline: "People of Traves, a war criminal, SS Peiper, is among us." The words were a catalyst, turning the friendly nods of neighbors into cold, suspicious glares. Then came the red paint, a jagged, angry SS emblazoned on the road leading to his property, a mark that bled into the asphalt under the afternoon sun. The national press had discovered his hideaway, and the name Joachim Peiper, once associated with the most brutal panzer divisions of the war, was now on everyone's lips. He had received the phone calls, voices filled with a low, vibrating hatred, promising that his time in France was coming to an end. Recognizing the scent of danger, he had sent his wife and children away to safety, leaving him alone in the house with only his dogs and his memories. He sits now in his study, surrounded by the history books he spent his days translating, the silence of the room so profound that he can hear the rapid, fluttering heartbeat of a moth against the window pane. He is a man who understands the nature of an enemy, and he knows that tonight, the celebration in the village is merely a curtain for what is to come. Outside, the night is punctuated by the sudden, sharp cracks of firecrackers. To the villagers, these are sounds of joy, of liberation, and of light. To the man inside Le Renfort, they are auditory phantoms of a different time. Each pop and hiss of a rocket ascending into the indigo sky sends a ripple through the air, shaking the heavy, still leaves of the oaks that crowd the house. The humidity has become an almost liquid presence, making every movement feel slow and deliberate. Peiper moves toward his terrace, his hand brushing against the cold, tarnished brass of his hunting rifle. The metal is smooth and reassuring, a tether to the world he once dominated. He stands in the shadows of the porch, the scent of the coming rain mixing with the ozone of the distant fireworks. The woods are a wall of blackness, vibrating with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But there is another sound now, a heavy, rhythmic crunch of many feet moving through the dry leaves, a sound that does not belong to the forest. It is a calculated, predatory approach. Shadows detach themselves from the trees, darker than the night itself, moving with a silent, synchronized purpose toward the glow of the house. The first strike is not a bullet, but a flash of light that rivals the fireworks over the village square. A glass bottle, filled with gasoline and capped with a flaming rag, arches through the air, a graceful, lethal arc that ends in a spectacular shatter against the study window. The glass disintegrates with a sound like 1,000 tiny bells, followed immediately by the roar of ignited fuel. The curtains catch in an instant, the heavy fabric turning into a sheet of orange silk that climbs toward the wooden rafters. Peiper is thrown into motion, the heat of the fire blooming against his skin with a ferocity that takes his breath away. Another bottle follows, then another, the house becoming a target in a dark, violent game. The air inside fills with a thick, gray smoke that tastes of chemicals and scorched paper. He reaches for his pistol, the grip warm in his palm, and fires 3 times into the darkness beyond the terrace. The metallic clatter of the empty shells hitting the stone is the last sound of the man who was Joachim Peiper. The fire is a living thing now, devouring the library, the translations, and the very structure of Le Renfort. It roars with a hunger that cannot be sated, turning the sanctuary into a kiln. As the roof begins to buckle and the stars are blotted out by a pillar of black smoke, the silence of the woods returns, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the distant, fading pops of the Bastille Day celebration. The flash of the gasoline bottle against the stone wall is a sudden, violent punctuation to a silence that had been years in the making. Before the flames began to climb the timber frames of the house known as Le Renfort, there was only the deep, heavy stillness of the Haute-Saône countryside. To understand the fire, we must first understand the quiet that preceded it. In the winter of 1970 and 1971, a graying man with sharp, disciplined features arrived in the village of Traves. He did not come with the roar of engines or the clatter of iron that had defined his youth. Instead, he came with the soft rustle of blueprints and a desire to vanish into the emerald folds of the Vosges foothills. He had chosen this place for its isolation, a small community of barely 350 souls, where the river Saône curved like a silver ribbon through the tall grass. Here, among the ancient oaks and the damp smell of river mist, the former commander sought to build a fortress of normalcy. The house was modest, perhaps 100 square meters of stone and wood, perched on a secluded bank where the only witnesses to his daily life were the birds and the shifting shadows of the forest floor. For several years, the man the neighbors knew simply as the German lived a life of rhythmic, scholarly precision. Every morning, the cool air of the valley would drift through his open windows, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. He would sit at a heavy wooden desk, the surface cluttered with dictionaries and technical manuals. His career as a warrior had been replaced by the solitary labor of a translator. Under the pseudonym of Rainer Bushman, he spent his hours meticulously converting English military histories and technical prose into German. Imagine the sound of his typewriter, a rhythmic, mechanical staccato that echoed through the quiet house like a ghost of the telegraphs he once sent from the front lines. He worked for hours on end, his fingers moving over the keys with the same intensity he had once applied to maps of the Ardennes. He translated for automotive giants like Porsche, a company that had once provided him with employment in the years after his release from prison, before the whispers of his past grew too loud for the factory floors of Stuttgart to ignore. In Traves, however, the whispers were distant. He was seen as a polite, if somewhat aloof, neighbor who paid his bills on time and kept his hedges trimmed to a military sharpness. The villagers would see him occasionally, a tall, upright figure walking his 2 dogs along the riverbank. His wife, Sigurd, was the one who frequented the local shops, buying bread and cheese with a quiet smile that revealed nothing of the weight they carried. They were the inhabitants of a ghost story that had not yet been told to the town. The French authorities had granted him a residence permit in 1972, a document that was intended to last until 1977. For a time, it seemed the world had forgotten that the man in the house on the hill was once the youngest regimental colonel in the Waffen-SS, the favorite adjutant of Heinrich Himmler. But secrets in a small village are like embers buried under ash. They require only a small gust of wind to reignite. The wind, in this case, came in the form of a casual errand. In 1976, a local ironmonger in the nearby town of Wessel was leafing through a publication known as the Brown Book, a directory of former Nazi officials. He saw a name, a face, and a history that matched the quiet neighbor who occasionally purchased wire fencing and nails from his store. The connection was made with the turn of a page, the paper dry and brittle between his fingers. The discovery did not stay within the confines of the ironmongery for long. It reached the ears of Jean-Pierre Dumont, a journalist for the newspaper El Humanite, who began to pull at the threads of this hidden life. The investigation was not a loud affair at first. It was a slow gathering of records, a cross-referencing of trial transcripts and old military photographs. In June of 1976, the quiet of the village was shattered not by a bomb, but by the distribution of flyers. Imagine walking out of your door on a bright summer morning to find small squares of paper scattered across the cobblestones, the ink still fresh and pungent. The flyers screamed in bold, black letters, "People of Traves, a war criminal, SS Peiper, is among us." The name Joachim Peiper, once whispered in the halls of power and shouted in the chaos of battle, was now pinned to the trees and stuck under the windshield wipers of cars. The mask of Rainer Bushman had been torn away, leaving the man in Lorenfort exposed to the cooling air of a French summer that was suddenly turning hostile. The atmosphere in the village shifted with a chilling speed. The polite nods from neighbors were replaced by cold stares and turned backs. On the road leading into Traves, the words Paper SS were painted in large, aggressive strokes of white, a permanent reminder that the past had arrived to claim its due. The telephone in the house began to ring at odd hours, filled with the heavy breathing of anonymous callers or the sharp, jagged threats of those who had not forgotten the massacres of the war. Despite the growing storm, Peiper remained. He was a man of cold iron and rigid pride, refusing to flee even as the threats grew more explicit. He sent his wife and children away to the safety of Switzerland, watched their car disappear down the winding valley road, and then turned back to his silent house. He armed himself with a hunting rifle and a pistol, patrolling the perimeter of his property like a sentry in a forgotten outpost. He gave interviews to the journalists who swarmed the village, his voice calm and unrepentant, claiming he had already paid the price for his actions with his years in prison. But the village of Traves was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a cage of his own making. As the heat of July 1976 descended upon the Vosges, the tension reached a shimmering, unbearable peak. The air felt heavy, charged with the electricity of an approaching storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Peiper sat in his library, surrounded by the books he had translated, the rhythmic ticking of a clock the only sound in the rooms that had once felt like a home. Outside, the shadows of the oaks lengthened, stretching across the lawn like dark fingers reaching for the stone walls. He knew the flyers were only the beginning. He knew that the piece he had tried to build was a house of cards, and the wind was rising. The village, once so welcoming in its anonymity, now watched him with 1,000 eyes from behind closed shutters. Every snap of a dry twig in the forest, every rustle of the river reeds, sounded like a footstep. He waited, a man who had survived the frozen plains of the East and the snows of the Ardennes, only to find himself trapped in the golden light of a French summer. The quiet was ending, and the fire was coming. The summer of 1976 did not arrive with a breeze, but with a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to trap the village of Traves in a golden, airless cage. The sun was a relentless, pale disk, bleaching the fields of hot sand until the grass turned to the color of brittle parchment. In this heat, every sound carried further than it should. The lowing of a distant cow, the rhythmic clink of a bicycle chain, the dry rustle of the poplar trees along the banks of the river Seine. It was on the morning of June 22nd that the shimmering peace finally shattered. A copy of the newspaper, El Humanité, arrived in the region, its ink dark and bold against the newsprint. Inside, an article posed a chilling question to the nation. Who is protecting the war criminals? The text did more than ask. It pointed a finger directly at the quiet, graying man living in the house known as Le Renfort. The veil of anonymity that Joachim Peiper had draped around himself for 6 years was torn away in a single morning, leaving him exposed under the harsh, unforgiving light of the French midsummer. The neighbors who had known him only as the polite German, the man who spoke softly and kept to his books, now saw a different face staring back from the shadows of history. The transition from suspicion to active hostility was as sudden as a summer storm. On the night of June 21st, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadowy figures moved through the narrow streets of the village. They carried bundles of paper, tracts printed with a message that would haunt the breakfast tables of Traves the following morning. The leaflets were titled with a warning: "Residents of Traves, a war criminal is among you." The paper felt thin and cheap, the edges rough against the fingers of the villagers as they pulled them from their mailboxes or found them tucked into the iron scrollwork of their gates. The words described a man who had been the adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, a commander whose soldiers had left a trail of fire and blood through the Ardennes. As the villagers read, the air in the valley seemed to grow even heavier, thick with the scent of dry pine and the collective realization that a ghost from the Second World War was walking their woods. The quiet respect that had once defined his interactions in town evaporated, replaced by a cold, watchful silence that followed him whenever he stepped out for bread or mail. By the final week of June, the threats took on a more visceral, visual form. One morning, the winding asphalt road that led toward Peiper's secluded property was no longer just gray and weathered. Great, jagged letters had been splashed across the surface in paint the color of fresh arterial blood. The word PEIPER, followed by the jagged runic symbols of the SS, stretched across the lane, the red paint still tacky and wet in the morning dew. It looked like a wound on the landscape. Every time Joachim drove his car toward the village, he was forced to roll his tires over his own name, over that accusation in red. The graffiti did not stop at the road. It appeared on stone walls and signposts, always in that same violent shade of crimson. It was as if the very earth was beginning to bleed his secrets. He would stand at the edge of his property, the smell of damp earth and drying paint mixing in the humid air, looking down at the letters that promised he would never find peace in this valley again. The red paint seemed to glow in the twilight, a constant, glowing reminder that his past had finally caught up to his present. Then came the sounds in the night. The silence of the forest, once a comfort, became a source of dread. Inside the thick stone walls of Le Renfort, the telephone began to ring at hours when the rest of the world was asleep. It was a sharp, mechanical trill that cut through the darkness like a blade. When Peiper would reach out his hand to lift the heavy black receiver, his fingers brushing the cold plastic, he would often find only a hollow, breathing silence on the other end. Sometimes a voice would cut through the static, low, distorted, and filled with a quiet, simmering rage. The callers did not scream, they whispered. They spoke of the 14th of July, the great national holiday of France, and they told him that he must be gone before the first firework touched the sky. They warned him that the ground he walked on was French soil, and it would no longer tolerate his shadow. He would hang up the phone, the dial clicking back into place with a finality that echoed in the empty hallway, and he would sit in the dark, listening to the creak of the floorboards and the frantic beating of his own heart, wondering which shadow outside his window was a tree and which was a man. The pressure within the village of Traves became a physical weight that pressed against the walls of his home. The mayor, Ernest Rigoulat, made his stance clear, reflecting the growing unease of the 357 residents. There was no longer any room for the German in their community. Recognizing the escalating danger, Joachim made a difficult choice for those he loved. He watched as his wife, Sigurd, packed her bags, the sound of zippers and the rustle of clothing filling the rooms that had once felt like a sanctuary. He walked her to the car, the door shutting with a heavy, metallic thud that signaled the end of their life together in the woods. He sent her and their children away, back toward the safety of the German border, away from the red letters on the road and the ringing telephone. As the car's taillights faded into the green canopy of the forest, Joachim returned to the house alone. The rooms felt cavernous now, filled with the scent of his cigars and the ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down to a deadline he could no longer ignore. He moved through the house, checking the locks on the heavy wooden doors, his shadow long and thin against the plaster walls. As July progressed, the atmosphere reached a fever pitch. The heat wave tightened its grip, the air so dry that the regional authorities banned all fireworks for the upcoming Bastille Day celebrations to prevent forest fires. The irony was not lost on the man inside Le Renfort. While the rest of France prepared for a quiet holiday under the sun, a different kind of fire was being prepared for him. The ultimatum was clear. Leave France by the 14th of July, or face the consequences of a debt that had been left unpaid for 30 years. He began to carry a weapon, a small pistol tucked into his pocket, its weight a cold comfort against his hip. He spent his days watching the perimeter of his land, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for the flash of a lens or the movement of a jacket. The letters written in red on the road had faded slightly under the baking sun, turning to a dull, rusty brown, but the message remained as sharp as ever. The village had turned its back, the family was gone, and the deadline was drawing near. In the suffocating heat of that July evening, the house on the hill stood in total isolation, a fortress of wood and stone waiting for the shadows to finally step out from the trees. The clock inside the silent house of Le Renard clicked toward the hour of midnight on the night of July 13th, 1976. Outside, the village of Traves was a tapestry of deep shadows and silver moonlight, draped in a heat so thick it felt like a physical weight against the skin. The air in the department of Haute-Saône was stagnant, holding the scent of parched earth and the drying leaves of the nearby woods. Inside his home, Joachim Peiper sat alone. He had sent his wife, Sigurd, and their children across the border to the safety of Germany days earlier, leaving him in the company of only his dogs and the heavy silence of a man who knew he was being hunted. The threats had been rising like the summer temperature, scrawled in red paint on the local roads and whispered in the village markets. He had chosen to stay, a decision born of a soldier's stubbornness, or perhaps a deep-seated belief that his walls would hold against the tide of history. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning softly under his weight, while the faint, rhythmic panting of his dogs provided the only heartbeat in the room. The darkness outside was absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of a firefly or the distant, lonely call of a night bird. But beneath that peace, a tension was coiling, a spring tightened to the point of breaking. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. It began not with a shout, but with the crunch of gravel and the dry snap of twigs beneath heavy boots. A group of shadows moved through the trees, their silhouettes cutting across the moonlit clearing toward the house. Peiper, ever the tactician, had prepared for this moment. He reached for the weapons he kept close at hand, a 12-gauge shotgun and a .22 caliber rifle. His fingers, aged but steady, traced the cold metal of the barrels. Then came the sound that would define his final hour. The sharp, crystalline crash of a window pane being smashed in his study. This was followed almost instantly by the dull thud of something heavy landing on the floorboards. The night air was suddenly pierced by the acrid, biting scent of gasoline. A Molotov cocktail, a crude but effective engine of destruction, erupted into a bloom of orange fire. The flames licked hungrily at the curtains, turning the fabric into a curtain of golden light that cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. A second bottle followed, then a third, each one a small sun born of glass and liquid fuel. The heat began to rise, a dry and suffocating wave that forced the oxygen from the room. Outside, his dogs began to howl in distress, their cries mixing with the low, guttural roar of the growing inferno. Peiper did not flee. In those chaotic moments, his priority was not his own life, but the records of it. He scrambled toward his desk, his eyes stinging from the burgeoning smoke that began to curl along the ceiling like a living thing. On that desk lay the drafts of his memoirs, the documents he believed would justify his actions and preserve his version of the truth for a world that had already judged him. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, fueled by the bone-dry timber of the house and the summer drought that had turned the structure into a tinderbox. He could hear the crackle of the wood as it surrendered to the heat, a sound like 1,000 tiny bones breaking at once. He gathered the papers into his arms, the edges of the parchment already turning brown and brittle. The smoke was thickening now, a gray-black veil that obscured the exits and turned the familiar hallways into a labyrinth of heat and terror. He fired his weapons into the darkness of the yard, the muzzle flashes briefly outshining the fire, but there were no targets to hit, only the retreating sounds of the men who had brought the sun to his doorstep at 2 in the morning. The physical reality of the fire began to take its toll. The temperature inside the house climbed to a level that made every breath a searing pain. The smoke, heavy with the chemicals of the gasoline and the varnish of the old furniture, filled his lungs, replacing the life-giving air with a toxic fog. He retreated further into the back of the house, clutching his documents, his shotgun still held in one hand as a useless talisman against an enemy he could not shoot. The floorboards beneath his feet were becoming soft, the structural integrity of the home failing as the beams overhead began to groan under the pressure of the heat. He reached a small back room, perhaps hoping for a pocket of air or a moment of respite, but the fire followed him with a relentless, predatory hunger. The walls were glowing now, an eerie, translucent red, and the sound of the blaze had grown into a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. In those final minutes, the man who had commanded panzer divisions in the frozen wastes of Russia was reduced to a solitary figure in a small French village, fighting a war against an element that knew no mercy. He collapsed onto the floor, the documents spilling around him like fallen leaves, as the darkness of smoke finally overcame the light of the flames. As the clock moved past 2 in the morning, the roof of Le Renard finally gave way, collapsing in a spectacular fountain of sparks that rose high into the night sky of Traves. The neighbors, watching from a safe distance, saw the structure vanish into a wall of flame that seemed to touch the stars. The heat was so intense that the firemen who eventually arrived could do little more than prevent the blaze from spreading to the surrounding forest. The house burned until the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, leaving behind only a blackened skeleton of stone and twisted metal. When the embers were cool enough to search, the investigators found what remained of Joachim Peiper. He was lying in the ruins of the back room, his body charred beyond recognition, huddled near the remnants of his rifle and the ashes of the papers he had tried so desperately to save. There was no sign of the men who had thrown the bottles, no footprints left in the scorched grass. The silence of the village returned, heavier than before, as the smoke drifted away on a light morning breeze. The man who had survived the greatest battles of the 20th century had met his end in a small wooden house, consumed by a fire that had been smoldering for over 30 years. The fierce oranges and yellows that had consumed the night slowly bled into a bruised, smoky gray as the first light of dawn touched the hills of the hot Sayon. The intense, roaring heat of the conflagration had finally surrendered to the damp morning air, leaving behind a skeletal silence that felt heavier than the smoke itself. In the village of Traves, the 19th century landscape seemed to hold its breath. The valley was draped in a thick, wet mist that clung to the surfaces of the remaining stone walls, mixing with the scent of sodden ash and charred pine. What had once been the secluded sanctuary of Le Renard was now a jagged wound in the earth, a pile of blackened timber and twisted metal cooling under the gaze of the rising sun. The gendarmes arrived as the last of the embers pulsed with a faint, dying heartbeat, their boots crunching softly on the gravel path that had seen so much tension in the weeks leading up to this moment. They did not rush. There was a profound sense that the urgency of the night had passed, leaving only the slow, meticulous work of sifting through the wreckage of a life and a death. Stepping into the ruins was like entering a hollowed-out cavern of charcoal. The investigators moved with a practiced, somber caution, their gloved hands reaching out to touch the jagged edges of what had been a quiet home. Every movement stirred a fine, velvet-like soot that coated their uniforms and filled the air with a dry, bitter taste. The floorboards of the upper level had long since surrendered to the flames, collapsing in a chaotic heap into the ground floor and the cellar below. Among the piles of burnt books and charred furniture, they found the remnants of a life translated into ash. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of burnt paper, melted plastic, and something far more primal. It was here, amidst the tangled wires and the iron frame of a bed, that they encountered a shape that did not belong. It was a fragile, blackened husk, a carbonized form that seemed to have been sculpted from the very shadows of the fire. The heat had been so intense, so unrelenting, that it had transformed the human element into something unrecognizable, a shrunken statue of charcoal that bore little resemblance to the man who had occupied the house just hours before. The forensic challenge was immediate and daunting. The remains had been subjected to such extreme temperatures that the body had shrunken significantly, measuring only about 60 to 80 centimeters in length. The limbs had been largely consumed by the furnace-like conditions, leaving a core that seemed to defy identification. To the naked eye, it was a ghost of a person, a fragment of history caught in a moment of final, violent transition. The investigators worked with surgical patience, clearing away the debris that lay heavy upon the corpse. They found that the victim was lying on his left side, his back to a wall, with one arm bowed before his chest in a final, defensive posture. There were no visible bullet wounds in the flesh that remained, though the presence of smoke in the lungs would later reveal that he was alive and breathing when the walls began to burn. Near the body, they discovered the metallic remains of his final resistance. A Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver and several boxes of cartridges that had cooked off in the heat, their brass casings scattered like spent seeds among the embers. A .22 caliber rifle, loaned by a neighbor for protection, lay nearby, its wooden stock long since turned to dust. Identification would require more than just the presence of his favorite weapons. The authorities sought a definitive link to the man known as Joachim Peiper. They turned to the only parts of the body that often survive the most hellish fires: the teeth. Through a painstaking examination of a dental bridge and the few teeth that remained, forensic experts were able to cross-reference records from decades past. The match was chillingly precise. This shrunken, carbonized fragment was indeed the former colonel, the man who had once been the youngest of his rank, now reduced to a weightless specimen in a coroner's bag. Outside the house, the investigation turned toward the perpetrators who had vanished into the humid July night. There were clues, though they were as fragmented as the house itself. In the tall grass and among the scorched bushes, the gendarmes found the remnants of the attack. The shattered glass of Molotov cocktails and an unexploded incendiary device that had failed to ignite. These crude petrol bombs spoke of a deliberate, organized intent. Somewhere in the shadows, a group had watched the flames rise, satisfied that their work was complete. They had not come to steal, they had come to erase. The air in Traves grew colder as the sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows over the curious villagers who gathered at a distance. The silence of the town was layered with a complex mix of relief and unease. The telephone at the local newspaper, El Auror, had already rung with a message from a group calling themselves the Avengers, or the Committee for Action on Behalf of Resistance Fighters and Deportees. They claimed the fire as their own, a long-delayed act of justice for the thousands who had suffered under the regime the man in the house had so loyally served. But as the investigators combed the grounds, they found more evidence of the night's brutality. Peiper's dogs, his loyal companions in his self-imposed exile, were found dead nearby. One had been shot with a small-caliber 6.35mm pistol, a cold detail that suggested the attackers were prepared to silence anything that stood in their way. The garden, once a place of quiet translation and solitude, was now a crime scene of international significance, yet the village remained strangely mute. No one had seen the car drive up the track. No one had heard the breaking of glass or the first screams of the fire. The past had come to claim its due, and it seemed the forest itself was determined to keep the secret of who had held the match. As the afternoon shadows began to stretch across the ruins of Le Renard, the investigators prepared to transport the remains away from the valley. The mystery of the man's identity was technically solved by the dental records and the charred wristwatch found among the debris, yet a deeper, more spectral mystery was only beginning to grow. Rumors already began to circulate through the winding streets of the village and into the press rooms of Paris. Some wondered if the shrunken body was a decoy, a final deception by a man who had spent his life masterminding escapes and maneuvers. They whispered that perhaps the colonel had slipped away into the darkness before the first bomb was thrown, leaving a nameless substitute to take his place in the furnace. These theories thrived in the absence of a clear face or a recognizable form. To the world, Joachim Peiper had become a ghost long before the fire, and now, in the aftermath of the 14th of July, 1976, he had truly disappeared into the smoke. The charred timber continued to hiss as the moisture of the afternoon mist touched the cooling stone. A soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to whisper of secrets buried far beneath the ash, waiting for a time when the world was ready to listen to the full story of his end. The smoke did not vanish with the arrival of the morning sun. Instead, it clung to the surface of the Saône River, a heavy gray veil that seemed to press down upon the valley of Traves. As the investigators moved through the skeletal remains of the house known as Le Renfort, their boots crunched on a mixture of wet ash and shattered glass. The smell was overpowering, a thick, cloying scent of charred oak, melted insulation, and something deeper, something ancient that seemed to rise from the very soil. They found him in the center of the ruin, a small, darkened figure amidst the wreckage of a life built on shadows. Near his hands lay the twisted metal of a rifle and a pistol, their barrels warped by a heat so intense it had turned the glass of the windows into liquid pearls. The silence that followed the fire was not a peaceful one. It was a silence earned through violence, a quiet that felt as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the world to notice what had happened on the night of July 14th, 1976. The river continued its slow, indifferent crawl toward the south, its waters reflecting the blackened chimney that stood like a solitary, jagged tooth against the blue sky. There were no voices here now, only the soft, rhythmic lap of water against the bank and the occasional groan of a scorched timber settling into the dust. In the weeks that followed, the investigation became a dance of paper and ink, conducted in sterile rooms far from the scorched hillside. The French authorities, under the direction of the justice minister, spoke of utmost speed and thoroughness. They opened heavy, beige folders and filled them with hundreds of testimonies. They interviewed the shopkeepers who had sold the bread, the postman who had delivered the threats, and the neighbors who claimed to have seen nothing but the flickering orange light of the flames. But the files remained hollow. Despite the presence of a group calling itself the Avengers and the distribution of pamphlets that spoke of a debt finally paid, no names were ever written on the arrest warrants. The investigation moved with the ponderous weight of a machine that did not truly wish to find its target. Each interview ended in a shrug, each lead dissolved into the mist of the river. The forensic teams pored over the dental records and the remnants of a gold ring, confirming that the man who had died in the smoke was indeed the colonel who had once commanded the blowtorch battalion. Yet, as the months turned into years, the urgency faded. The signatures of the gendarmes grew fainter on the bottom of the reports, and the case of Joachim Peiper began to gather the fine, gray dust of the archives, a mystery that everyone understood but no one intended to solve. The village of Traves itself became a character in this final act, a place of shuttered windows and averted eyes. If you walk through its narrow streets today, you might feel the weight of a collective secret. The soil there is deep and rich, fed by the river and the seasons, and it keeps its secrets well. The people who lived through that Bastille Day night carried their stories to their graves, leaving behind only the ghost of a question. Was it justice that arrived in the form of a Molotov cocktail, or was it simply the final, inevitable spark of a fire that had been burning since the winter of 1944? There is a certain irony in the way the land reclaimed the site. Weeds began to push through the cracks in the foundation, their green shoots indifferent to the history of the man who had stood there. The barbed wire fence rusted and snapped, falling into the tall grass where the two dogs had once patrolled. Nature has a way of smoothing over the jagged edges of human cruelty, covering the scars of the earth with moss and wildflower. The house is gone now, replaced by the persistent, quiet growth of the forest, but the memory of the smoke still seems to linger in the damp air of the valley whenever the wind turns toward the east. The legacy of the colonel is not found in a grave or a monument, but in the unsettling ripples he left in the water of history. For some, his death was a poetic closure, a mirroring of the villages he had once ordered to be burned in the mountains of Italy and the plains of Russia. For others, it was a failure of the law, a moment where the darkness of the past was met with a different kind of darkness. The 84 men at the crossroads of Malmedy, the civilians of Boves, the countless lives extinguished by the advance of his tanks, they all seem to stand in the periphery of this story, silent witnesses to a final, lonely end. There are no heroes in these woods, only the long, stretching shadows of a century that struggled to find a balance between vengeance and peace. As the sun dips below the horizon, the hills of the Haute-Saône turn a deep, bruised purple. The river reflects the last of the light, shimmering like a cold blade. The soil of France, which has seen so much blood and so many wars, finally accepts the silence. It does not judge the bones it holds. It simply waits for the snow to fall, and for the memory of the fire to fade into the white expanse of time. We are left now with the stillness of the valley. The investigation has long since been shuttered, and the names of the attackers remain whispered legends, lost to the rustle of the poplar trees. The colonel was eventually taken back to Germany, laid to rest in a family plot in Landsberg, far from the river that witnessed his final breath. But the questions remain, drifting like the embers of that July night. Can a man ever truly outrun the ghosts of his own making? Or does the earth always find a way to settle its accounts? As you listen to the rhythm of your own breath, imagine the cool, damp air of the French countryside. Feel the safety of your own bed, the solidness of the walls around you. The past is a heavy cloak, but tonight you may set it down. The fires have all gone out. The river has carried the ash away. There is nothing left to fear in the dark. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.